Welcome to HBR Quarantine. I'm Adi Ignatius, Editor-in-Chief of Harvard Business Review, and my co-host is Josh Mocht, who heads Product and Innovation for Harvard Business Review. We created HBR Quarantine a few months ago to connect with our subscribers and fans who suddenly found themselves in lockdown. We've used the show to talk about the most pressing problems facing us all, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement and racial injustice more broadly in the workplace, and the path to economic recovery. This is our final week before we're going to take a 2-month break for the summer. We have two amazing guests this week. Today we'll be speaking with Kristalina Georgieva, who is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. We'll be talking about prospects for business recovery. And then this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, our guest will be Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's most prominent infectious disease specialist. We thank you all for viewing, for being part of the show. And like always, we invite you to send questions today in the comment box for Kristalina Georgieva. So first, I want to do a quick sponsorship note. In the current crisis if the current crisis we are living through has taught us anything, it is that academic institutes, research and policy centers, hospitals, as well as the general public need to work together to find local solutions to global challenges. And that's exactly what the sponsor of this episode, Qatar Foundation, has been doing over the past 25 years. Qatar Foundation has created a unique campus in the heart of Doha called Education City, where some of the world's top universities and schools are located a walking distance from research centers, global policy hubs, a tech park, a hospital, a national library, and many other scholastic centers. The result is a model fostering collaboration between people and institutions from a range of industries and backgrounds, all working toward a healthier and more secure future. Learn more about Qatar Foundation at qf.org.qa. So before we bring in our special guest, Kristalina Georgieva from the International Monetary Fund, I just want to set the stage a little bit. We're at a moment now where the global economy has been battered by the pandemic and the lockdown. In the US, the path for economic recovery seems uncertain. Many businesses reopened in May and June, helping to spark a quick rise in consumer spending. Some in the White House are still predicting a strong V-shaped recovery this year. But we're also still seeing a surge in COVID-19 cases in various American states. In some, the rate of hospitalizations is rising as well, meaning the problem is not just that we're testing more people and finding more positives. As a result, some state governors are backtracking now on measures to reopen the economy. U.S. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell is speaking today to the House Financial Services Committee saying a full recovery is unlikely until people are confident that it is safe to re-engage in a broad range of activities. The International Monetary Fund itself released figures last week forecasting that the overall world economy will shrink almost 5% this year, and that there'll be a $12 trillion loss globally to the world's economies this year and next. Plus, the poorest countries are likely to be hit hardest. The IMF predicts that the U.S. economy will shrink 8% this year, while rebounding 4.5% next year. So, here we are in the U.S. States are opening, states are closing. It's very confusing. Josh, I want to bring you in, and what are you seeing in your home in the great state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
Yeah, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We miss you, Adi. I mean, it feels like things were going well here, and you can see all that and read all that in statistics online. But of course now you just have this sense, and I think it's pretty clear, the virus is not under control. People are moving around. Areas all over the country are spiking, and that's hugely problematic. People are, and we still see that we just fundamentally don't have this thing under control. So for our conversation today, I think there's just so much of this backdrop of uncertainty that makes that I'm really eager to talk with Kristalina more about economic recovery in light of the uncertainty of the virus.
Yep. So let's bring her in 1 second. Regular viewers know that we like to show a TikTok video each episode that captures the moment we're living in. So here's one that shows a store near Miami, Florida that is exclusively devoted to all things COVID. Why not?
Hips tick tock when I dance. On that demon time, she might start her OnlyFans. Big B and that B stand for bands. If you want to see some real, baby.
Would you go to that store? You want to go to that store, Adi?
I mean, it's got everything COVID-19. I mean, it's probably a great business model. So let's bring in our special guest. This is Kristalina Georgieva, who's managing director of the International Monetary Fund. She was born in Bulgaria. She trained as an economist, including at the Karl Marx Higher Institute of Economics in Sofia. She earlier served as CEO of the World Bank, and as its interim president, she has headed the IMF for a bit less than a year. So, Kristalina, welcome to HPR Quarantine.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Wonderful to join you.
Excellent. So you took over the IMF 9 months ago. This is the definition of a trial by fire. What have these sort of insane 9 months taught you?
Well, the most amazing thing is that when I started 9 months ago, it feels like ages ago, my biggest worry was that growth was anemic. Only 3.4% projection for that year. And here we are today, our projections for 2020 minus 4.9%. For me, it was like my whole life I have been building up skills to deal with a massive crisis. You mentioned I was born in Bulgaria, and I lived through a dramatic economic collapse in the 90s. I still remember getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to queue for milk for my daughter. And then a part of my experience is being crisis commissioner. For 5 years, I had front row seat in all the calamities, earthquakes, conflicts, hurricanes, floods. What that taught me, and I'm applying it here at the fund, very important lesson. Anticipate. Crisis will come. You don't know when, you don't know what, but it will be there. Act early and act decisively. And that is what we have done at the fund. Adi, we have deployed so far emergency financing for 72 countries. Never in the history of the IMF we have done so much so quickly, and we are ready to do as much as necessary to be part of this putting a floor under this crisis, especially for the most vulnerable countries.
Kristalina, we clearly have to get through the crisis, and I like the way you're framing it in terms of moving swiftly. But global trade was already under a lot of pressure with nationalism. The pandemic comes along, really slows things down. I just wonder, from your point of view, are we at a moment where sort of the globalism or global trade has kind of peaked, or is there recovery ahead as we get past COVID, and what has to happen to get there?
You're bringing a very important question. Before the pandemic hit us, we had significant problems to wrestle with. One is the fraction in trade and tensions that have already stepped on the brakes of trade and global integration. Another one is low productivity growth, from where this anemic growth I spoke about in the beginning originates. We also had in 2019 a very serious problem with protests, people on the streets, mostly driven by a sense of inequality, unfairness in societies. None of these things have gone away. And as we are thinking of coming out of this crisis, it would be prudent to put in place policies and actions that help us to be stronger, more resilient on the other side. And that includes trade and broadly international cooperation. So you know it. It is very straightforward, very simple. When we trade with each other, we are all better off. When we don't, costs go up, incomes go down, and poverty spreads. Mm-hmm. So we do have to be relentlessly working on addressing the root causes of disappointment with trade and globalization. We know them too. One is that trade and agreements have not evolved with the economy. Our economy today is much more based on services. E-commerce is exploding. Intellectual property matters a lot. None of these things are integrated in trade agreements. So no wonder people are not pleased. And then we have the issue of fairness. As we expand these interactions, are we making sure that everybody benefits? And the answer is no. We have seen that country by country by country, and it has had ramifications also in the political landscape. What can we do? Okay, the problems we can diagnose. What can we do? Well, one, we do need to build a consistent resolution of the problems we have. I really very much hope that whoever takes the helm at the World Trade Organization would drive reforms and change. Two, organizations like mine, we have to be candid at the level of countries and in global discussions around the problems that are there, not gloss over them, and then work on how they can be resolved. And three, everybody who is in communications, we have to give people very clear answers as to why that matters. So here is one. If you are poor, it matters to you much more than if you are rich. If you are poor, global trade, shrinks the price of what you pay by 3/4, two-thirds to 3/4. In other words, you benefit tremendously. If you're rich, you benefit, but it is 1/3 to 1/4 cheaper what you buy. So we have to be out there on this and not shy away from this discussion. Not be afraid to engage, even if people are angry and they press us. Stay engaged. Make sure we don't lose the benefit of trade that has served the world for thousands of years.
So let me jump in. Well, first of all, if you just joined us, this is HPR Quarantine. Our special guest is Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. If you have questions for her, please put them in the comments box, and we'll get to some questions later. So basically what you're saying is the old adage, you should never waste a good crisis. But I want to ask you, like, specifically, I know some of your most important causes are addressing inequality and fostering a kind of a green development plan. Practically, economies, leaders are trying to survive, trying to get their economy from negative into positive. So how do we use this crisis? How do we actually make progress in these areas that you care so much about?
Well, we know that governments, especially in advanced economies, as well as central banks, have demonstrated they are capable of decisive action. What they have done by accommodative monetary policy, massively expanding liquidity, and huge fiscal measures when we put the economy in standstill has been remarkable, and it needs to be appreciated for the incredible help it has given us in this crisis. We have now almost 11 trillion. I'm sorry, I'm still struggling with these huge numbers we have to operate with. We have $11 trillion in fiscal measures, and we have at least $6 trillion in asset purchasing. What we know is that because of these actions, we have not faced massive bankruptcies and we have not faced massive unemployment that could have led to tremendous increase in inequality. So action is being taken. Going forward, we also know that governments will have to put in place fiscal stimulus, and we hear in different places the European Union has a plan, 750 billion euros recovery plan. The UK is talking about massive stimulus. Here in the United States, the number that is being mentioned is about $1 trillion of additional measures. Question is, how would this money be used? We can just throw it around willy-nilly and businesses will do well, or we can be strategic about the direction to travel. And I personally believe that as it has been done during the global financial crisis, we have to think how we strategically deploy this stimulus. There is clear priority to prevent a climate crisis that can be catastrophic. And we know what are the investments that need to be done in low carbon climate resilient development, and they happen to be many of them job-rich investments and innovation-rich investments, all very good for the future. Deforestation has been a major problem, land degradation, mangroves have been destroyed massively. We need to have building insulation to reduce emissions. There are many, many things that smart stimulus can generate private investments and the jobs that we need to also deal with the risk of deepening inequality. And then we have the thinking that governments ought to do about growth prospects for the future. And one thing this crisis is telling us is that the digital transformation is accelerating. So you do need to think about equality through access to digital. And we have seen, for example, in this crisis, how that is helping businesses to thrive. And we have seen in China how it has helped to more quickly return to growth on the basis of massive digital infusion for businesses. Underlying is investing in people. And you spoke about universities. Today is the time to say, okay, for the next crisis, to be agile and resilient, it is so critical that people are healthy, they have access to healthcare, that they are able to function in an agile manner, and that learning can be done remotely. Also, we learned that there has to be automatic social safety net, a stabilizer, that if there is a shock, people don't fall off the cliff with all the consequences for demand, for the economy, but also for growing inequality. So they are very practical policies. And if we are determined, we see some of these policies now being applied in different places. We ought to transmit this learning very rapidly, not to miss on this chance. And I can tell you, if we miss, history is not going to judge us kindly.
Kristalina, I'm curious how you guys are, in the business of economic forecasts. It seems so difficult, as an outsider, to think about that when we don't really understand this virus. So right. how do you factor that into these? Because we're being told, like, think about V or U or all these different recoveries, but we don't really know the big part of the story.
This is such a great question. What we are doing at the IMF is very radically changing the way our models provide projections for us to share with the rest of the world. We are integrating in macroeconomic models epidemiological projections, and then we are relying to fine-tune these projections to high frequency indicators that we used before, and now we use much more. In other words, tapping into big data, things like electricity consumption, pollution levels, tells you where industry and transport are revitalizing, using data on hotel bookings, on travel, things like publishing advertisements for jobs, what the recruiters are telling us in terms of movements in the job market, mobility data from cell phones. All of this fits into our gigantic macro models, and even with this, I must stress what you said in the beginning. We are at a time of unusually high uncertainty. Why? Because all of this helps us to establish the past and then try to look into the future, but it doesn't quite tell us whether policies would be smart, whether the responses would be well targeted, whether reopening would be done in a responsible manner. Neither it tells us what the epidemiological picture would be in the fall or next year. And one thing we now know is that, like the economies that have two hands, on one hand, on another, epidemiologists are also with two hands. And that makes it so very difficult. What we now do at the fund is to be much faster in updating our projections. Normally, we would come maximum 4 times a year. There will be 2 times a year when we put out big reports. Now we come more frequently. We had a projection in April. We are now coming in June. We are going to have another one in October or even earlier, so we can fine-tune what we are telling as a story, and then fine-tune the recommendations that come out of this story. The very last one, the recommendations that come from the very last one. First, forget about the hope that we will get rid of the pandemic and then start the recovery. We have to move with the recovery while the pandemic is still with us. That would make it more uneven, and it would, unfortunately, slow it down somewhat. Mm-hmm. We also learned that agility in policymaking now becomes even more pressing. So take evidence, take the data, and then adjust your decisions, your policy guidance and actions accordingly. And it also tells us that we cannot withdraw fiscal support too quickly. We have to not only put the floor under the world economy, but then keep this floor until there is scientific breakthrough. Yep. And very important, it tells us these are massive fiscal measures. Be sure to keep the receipts, to be accountable to the taxpayers for how you spend their money.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting a number of good questions, and it's interesting to find out what people around the world are thinking about. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have been submitted. This first one is Jim from Aurora, Ohio. So you talked a little bit about technology, but the question is, what segment will be the biggest driver for economic recovery on a global scale?
Well, very clearly, anything that is digitally enabled wins. So what we are seeing is, broadly speaking, tech companies are doing much better. What we are seeing in terms of benefits from the digital transformation is a very massive increase in e-commerce. So if you are a small company and you haven't yet quite figured out how to connect to the internet, how to do your business, better do it very, very quickly, because this train has left the station. We are going to see definitely an expansion in the health services, and we would see more attention to sustainable agriculture, to everything that is connected to a more sustainable, if you wish, lifestyles. We know that industries would be shifting where industrial production is located. There would be some reshaping of the global value chains, understandably, because there has to be mitigation of exposure to shocks. By the way, this is a lesson that we knew from climate crisis, but it is now so much more amplified by this crisis. We also know that contact-intensive industries like travel, tourism, are going to take a hit. And anything that is done through technology to reduce contact is going to be a winner. So companies in this space are going to do really, really well. And hopefully, with the right policies in place, green growth, investing in low carbon, climate resilient will be a winner, and it would actually mean for rural areas, it may be a great thing because there is so much that can be done in the land management space.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually put two questions together from our audience. They're not identical, but they both, again, reflect people's concerns. So this one's from Vivek from Mumbai, India. Do you think it would be prudent to put money directly into the hands of people, or is it better to increase public spending on infrastructure? And then the second question from Fahad in France, do you think tax havens contribute to inequality? And what steps would you suggest to curb that?
So it is very important in this crisis that is very unusual, a crisis like no other. We have never lived through anything like this, to recognize that both demand and supply are being hit. We are asking producers not to produce. We are asking consumers not to consume. To prevent calamity, collapse of our economies, putting money in the hands of people is very important, because it gives that cushion for households, especially those that are affected by the standstill of production, but also in the informal economy, where many people live virtually hand to mouth. So digital technology today allows us to send money very quickly to end recipients, and many countries are doing that. These are social safety nets that are critical today, but they would be important when they're well targeted also for the future. At the same time, we will have to boost growth, and in that sense, public investment, I'll give you one example, digital infrastructure. If we want people to go digital, if we want inequality to shrink, that investment has to be made. It can be public-private partnership, doesn't have to be only the government. And we also know that in many countries, the question of high-quality public infrastructure still stands. So a long way to say that you actually have to do both, and do both in the most transparent and accountable manner, which means e-government. It means government that also goes digital, and citizens that can see what is the government doing with their money. On the question of tax avoidance, I mean, obviously this is a massive problem. It was a problem before the pandemic. It is becoming a bigger problem today, because governments everywhere are seeing drops in their revenues. and they're seeing increase in their expenditures. They're squeezed from both sides. So to be able to collect taxes to avoid this running in a place where you can actually protect yourself from doing your duty to your community, to communities and to countries, that is going to take even a higher prominence. At the fund, we are very keen to see in the next months and years coming out of this crisis, more attention to fiscal policies that contribute to more equitable development. Why? Because we know from prior crises, especially from prior pandemics like H1N1, Zika, SARS, that after pandemic, inequality goes up. Poor people with less education get more severely hit than the rest of society. How can you correct that? You can only correct it if you have fiscal policies that underpin more equality. And that would mean for some countries more redistribution to allow that fairness in society. Now, I want to stress that now is not the time to talk about changing taxation. Now is the time to go through the crisis in one piece. But time will come to have these discussions, and it would be about collecting taxes, reducing, and if possible, eliminating tax avoidance. And in many countries, this is a huge problem, and it also would mean how we adjust our fiscal policies for a more equitable development.
I mean, and the massive amount of debts that governments are taking on is going to have to be paid for at some point. I mean, the taxes seem inevitably going to need to change, which probably will just exacerbate what's already going to be a bad recession. I wanted to shift gears for a second just to the talk of vaccine, because there are so many people who are concerned that should we have a vaccine, it will be unevenly distributed around the world. The wealthiest will get it, or the countries where it's developed or manufactured. And I'm sure you share that concern, but I'm curious what the IMF's role is in helping to prevent something like that from happening.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And in months ago, when we saw this pandemic hitting, and then like dominoes falling, moving from one part of the world to another, and obviously going to now Latin America, Africa, while still low, 250,000 cases. With much less ability to handle and cases going up. At that time, my thought was, we have a solution. It is called advanced purchase commitments, and it has to be put in place to make sure that poor people in rich countries and poor countries have equal access to vaccine. And it is in the interest of everybody. It is in the interest of rich people in rich countries, because to stop this everywhere, we have to act everywhere. So I was extremely pleased that actually I had a couple of conversations with some of the leaders that have been also thinking about it, to remind them about this model of advanced purchase commitment. It was embraced by many, especially in Europe, and a commitment of about $8 billion has been made by multiple countries. So when vaccine is available, that production can be prepaid, if you wish, so developing countries can have access to it. What is the role of the fund? What we do is we are injecting liquidity in poor countries so they can boost their health systems and they can protect their most vulnerable people. This is where our massive emergency financing goes. And that means that you need the vaccine, but you need to have the doctors and the nurses and the clinics where the vaccine can be injected, or in whichever way it is being provided. This is where we are so critical to make sure that no country falls off the cliff in terms of fiscal capacity to build stronger health system in the midst of this terrible pandemic.
We had the CEO of Pfizer on, and he talked a lot about how individuals around the world should not bear the cost of a vaccine, but governments would. Do you interact with the heads of pharmaceuticals? Are you in that kind of contact?
Well, we interact very heavily with finance authorities, not so much with health authorities. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you, I have been very impressed by many leaders in the developing world who have taken this pandemic extremely seriously. If you look at actions that are taken in terms of lockdown, in terms of building stronger health systems in poor countries, they have been quite impressive. I was on the phone this morning with the Minister of Finance of Angola. Angola is in a very difficult place, in a dire situation, but Angola is prioritizing in a shrinking budget their health system, because they recognize that protecting lives and protecting the economy, livelihoods, go hand in hand. If the health system fails, if the measures to this, as much as possible, to do distancing, use masks, wash hands, and again, in the developing world, this is so much more difficult. But if these measures are in place, and if there is a health system in place, then the economy can be reopened and it can function. Without it, extremely difficult to cope.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
So, Kristalina, I have just one more question, and let's make some news here. What's your guess for the shape of the recovery in the U.S.? V, U, W. Please don't say M. What's your guess?
Well, where we are is on a global scale. We are projecting that it would be like the Nike symbol, a swoosh.
Swoosh, yeah.
Yeah, but we are saying there would be all kinds of shapes in different countries. We are not going to see the whole world moving in sync in and out of this crisis. So they may be used, they may be even in some countries. I'll give you one interesting example, Vietnam. Vietnam is doing a V shape because they acted very early and very decisively. So we will see a variety of letters in place. For the you're asking me about the U.S. The U.S. has taken very decisive measures, and it is now a matter of seeing how the pandemic is going to be contained in the next months. So ask me this question in the next round we have an interaction, and then I would be much better positioned to give you a projection.
All right, we will look for an opportunity.
Kristalina, thank you so much for talking with us today about these issues. Your job is definitely a difficult one for sure, but critically important. And it was great of you to spend a little bit of time from your busy schedule sharing your thoughts and perspectives and ideas with us and our entire audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us and for your great questions. We have the final episode of what I guess we're calling season 1 on Thursday, as Adi said, with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we're going to talk more about the pandemic and its impact on the economy and business and moving forward, where he thinks we are. That should be amazing. And we hope you all can join us. And thank you for coming today.
And we're back.
And we're back.
Behind the scenes.
Where's Kristalina? No, she's gone.
She's gone. Oh, she's still here.
Huh.
I was just stepping out and I saw you. So
Oh.
thank you very much. It was wonderful to have that conversation.
Yeah,
And
no,
you know what,
we're still live. I just want to warn you, we still have viewers. So
Yeah, people can stick around.
this is our sort of
But you can-
public
you-
after show.
You can ask us anything.
well, I was going to say that I'm going to tune in on your next conversation and see how Dr. Fauci is going to be responding to your questions.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
well,
we're very excited about that as well. Anyway, thank you. It's honestly it's kind of unthinkable to be running the IMF at a moment like this when the whole world is seemingly falling apart and is at varying levels of desperation. So we really appreciate you giving us your time.
yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, it's crazy to think. I find the whole thing to be that role to be so fascinating at this moment in time. Think about some of these countries and the pressure they're under. It's
Oh gosh, yeah.
oh, man.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking at some of the questions we weren't able to ask.
Oh, like what?
Well, some specific questions about the developing world
Mhm.
to alleviate short-term poverty, but then also the sort of next round of the fallout, especially given the lack of accessibility to technology. That was from Nicole in Cape Town.
Hmm.
Paul from Canada was asking about the refugee problem. What priority can we give? That was sort of
Wow.
top of the line until
Yeah.
now it's a few crises ago. More questions on relief versus stimulus. I think she talked articulately about that.
Yep.
How to apply modern monetary theory to solve the crisis from Yvonne in Houston. And actually, an interesting question from Noof in Ireland. Does she think the economic relationship between European countries will ever be the same? Or are we just in a different, more kind of fractured world?
Oh, these are great questions.
I know.
Oh.
Again, this show's got to be longer.
Well, now from now on, read some of the questions. I like that. I like hearing all the questions we didn't get to.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we have her for a part two. So
Yeah, I think she promised to come and tell us what shape the recovery will be.
All right, again.
God knows she has plenty to say.
Yeah.
Well, that's when we have our big quarantine party. We can get everyone together, Fauci and Kristalina and Bozema and the whole. Everyone
It's going to be a reunion.
coming to a giant party as soon as I don't know when.
As soon as Dr. Fauci says we can. We'll ask
As
him
soon as- yes. Thank you.
Yeah, we're not
Thursday.
reckless.
No, we're not reckless. No, we're not.
Not at all.
Hey, I have a new mask. Look, I have a new mask.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah, do you like it?
I
No,
do. I think that may be our.
very.
Hate it? Hate
it's
it?
all right. It's
Hey, you look like you hate it.
oh,
What about you viewers? Is there some polling thing? What are you viewers? Is it terrible?
Write it. Did you get that at the store in Miami?
I don't. No, I haven't gone to Miami yet.
Yeah, you could have ordered it online. Maybe they ship.
it kind of looks like cheesy artwork in a way. I don't know. Does it or no?
Well,
It's like,
walking
remember
the work of cheesy artwork. That's me.
You remember like back in the early, it feels like years ago, the Tiger King portion.
Sniffing it.
That's like a Tiger King mask. That's like,
Well, I think you make it look good.
Oh,
Yes, it makes you look better, as I think what Dave's saying.
can't hug the guy. I can't hug the big guy, but
I know. Well, I can virtually.
I know. You're good. You're good.
All right. There's probably one person still on, so to thank them for their service,
All right,
we should probably hang up.
That's probably my mom. So, where are you?
Bye, everybody.
All right.
See you in a
next
couple
week.
days.
Oh, it's a couple of days. Bye.
on Thursday.